Welcome back to Neural Battlefields. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating and terrifying periods in human history. A war that lasted nearly half a century. A war that threatened to end civilization itself. Yet, paradoxically, a war where the two main enemies never directly fired a single shot at each other. This is the story of the Cold War, and the truth behind it is far more shocking than you might imagine. Picture this. It's 1945. The Second World War has just ended. Cities across Europe and Asia lie in ruins. Millions are dead. The world is exhausted, broken, desperate for peace. But even as the guns fall silent, a new conflict is already beginning to take shape. Not with bullets and bombs at first, but with suspicion, ideology, and fear. Two superpowers emerge from the ashes of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union. Former allies in the fight against Nazi Germany, they now find themselves on opposite sides of an invisible battlefield that would divide the entire world. The United States represented capitalism, democracy, and individual freedom. The Soviet Union championed communism, collective ownership, and centralized control. These weren't just different economic systems. They were completely opposing visions of how human society should be organized. And both sides believed, truly believed, that their way was the only path forward for humanity. This ideological divide would shape everything that followed. But here's what makes the Cold War so uniquely terrifying. Both superpowers possessed nuclear weapons, weapons so powerful that a single bomb could obliterate an entire city in seconds. By the 1950s and 1960s, both nations had accumulated enough nuclear warheads to destroy human civilization multiple times over. This created a bizarre paradox known as mutually assured destruction. If either side launched a full-scale nuclear attack, the other would retaliate and both nations would be utterly annihilated. Nobody could win. Everybody would lose. So instead of fighting directly, they fought through proxies, espionage, propaganda, and psychological warfare. The world became their chessboard, and millions of people became pawns in their deadly game. Let's rewind for a moment and understand how we got here. During World War II, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union formed an alliance out of necessity. They had a common enemy in Nazi Germany, but beneath the surface, there was always tension. The Soviets had suffered enormously during the war, losing an estimated 27 million people. They were determined to create a buffer zone of friendly communist states in Eastern Europe to protect themselves from future invasions. The Americans and British, however, saw this as Soviet expansion and the spread of totalitarianism. They believed in free elections and democratic governments for the nations of Europe. The warning signs appeared even before the war ended. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the leaders of the three Allied powers, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, met to discuss the post-war reorganization of Europe. On the surface, they reached agreements. Beneath the surface, each leader had very different interpretations of what those agreements meant. Stalin wanted security through control. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted democracy and open markets. These conflicting visions would soon tear their alliance apart. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Soviet troops occupied most of Eastern Europe. Over the next few years, Stalin systematically installed communist governments in Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. Elections were held, but they were rigged. Opposition was crushed. Independent journalists were silenced. What had been liberated from Nazi tyranny now fell under Soviet control. Winston Churchill, no longer Britain's prime minister but still influential, delivered a speech in March 1946 that would define the era. He declared that an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Europe was split in two, East versus West, communist versus capitalist. The Cold War had officially begun. The United States responded with a strategy called containment. The idea was simple but profound. Don't try to roll back communism where it already exists. That might trigger World War III. Instead, contain it. Stop it from spreading any further. This doctrine, outlined by American diplomat George Kennan, would guide U.S. foreign policy for the next 4 decades. In 1947, President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support to any nation threatened by communist takeover. That same year, the Marshall Plan was launched, a massive economic aid program that pumped billions of dollars into Western Europe to help rebuild and prevent communist movements from gaining ground through economic desperation. It worked. Western Europe recovered and remained democratic, but it also deepened the divide. The first major crisis came in Berlin. Germany had been divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin, the capital, sat deep inside the Soviet zone but was also divided into 4 sectors. In June 1948, Stalin made a bold move. He ordered a complete blockade of West Berlin, cutting off all road, rail, and water access. His goal was to force the Western Allies out of the city. It was a test. Would the West fight for Berlin, risking war, or would they retreat? The Americans and British chose a third option. For nearly a year, they conducted the Berlin airlift, flying in supplies around the clock. Planes landed every few minutes, delivering food, coal, medicine, everything the city needed to survive. It was a logistical miracle and a propaganda victory. The Soviets eventually lifted the blockade in May 1949, but the damage was done. Later that year, Germany was officially split into 2 nations. West Germany allied with the West and East Germany under Soviet control. Berlin would remain a flashpoint for decades. Just months after the Berlin blockade ended, the Cold War went global. In October 1949, the Communists won the Chinese Civil War. The world's most populous nation was now communist. Then, in June 1950, Communist North Korea, backed by Stalin and China's Mao Zedong, invaded capitalist South Korea. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, intervened. For 3 brutal years, the Korean War raged. It was a proxy war, American and Chinese forces fighting while the Soviets provided weapons and advisors. When the armistice was signed in 1953, Korea remained divided along roughly the same line where the war began. Millions had died, and nothing had really changed. But the Cold War had proven it could turn hot very quickly. The 1950s brought another terrifying development, the nuclear arms race. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb. Years earlier than American intelligence had predicted, the U.S. nuclear monopoly was over. In response, America developed the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviets followed suit. Both sides built bigger and bigger arsenals. They developed intercontinental ballistic missiles that could deliver nuclear warheads across continents in minutes. There was no defense, no time to react. The world lived under the constant threat of nuclear annihilation. This fear permeated everyday life. In America, schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks as if that would protect them from a nuclear blast. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards. The government produced films explaining how to survive a nuclear attack, though the reality was far grimmer than the propaganda suggested. In the Soviet Union, the government promoted similar civil defense measures while maintaining strict control over information. Both populations lived with fear, though they experienced and expressed it differently. The Cold War wasn't fought only with weapons. It was fought with ideas, culture, and technology. Both sides engaged in massive propaganda campaigns, each portraying the other as evil, oppressive, and dangerous. The United States promoted its vision of freedom, democracy, and prosperity through radio broadcasts like Voice of America, cultural exchanges, and Hollywood films. The Soviet Union countered with its own media apparatus, emphasizing equality, collective progress, and the evils of capitalist exploitation. Each side genuinely believed they were defending humanity's future. The space race became one of the most dramatic arenas of Cold War competition. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, in October 1957, America was shocked. The Russians had beaten them into space. If they could launch a satellite, they could launch a nuclear warhead anywhere on Earth. The U.S. poured resources into its space program. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. America was losing. But President John F. Kennedy made a bold promise. America would put a man on the moon before the decade's end. In July 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. It was a triumph of science, engineering, and national will. It was also a powerful statement in the Cold War. America had won the space race. But space victories couldn't erase the crises on Earth. In 1961, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall, a physical barrier separating East and West Berlin. Families were divided overnight. People who worked on one side and lived on the other were trapped. The wall became the ultimate symbol of the Cold War's division. Over the next 3 decades, hundreds would die trying to cross it, shot by East German guards or killed by landmines and booby traps. The wall stood as a monument to fear and oppression. Then came October 1962, the month the world came closest to nuclear war. American spy planes discovered that the Soviet Union was secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. These missiles could strike American cities with virtually no warning. President Kennedy faced an impossible choice. Do nothing and allow the threat to stand. Invade Cuba and risk Soviet retaliation. Launch airstrikes and possibly start World War III. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba, stopping Soviet ships from delivering more missiles. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev refused to back down. Nuclear bombers were placed on high alert. Submarines with nuclear torpedoes prowled the Caribbean. One Soviet submarine captain came frighteningly close to launching a nuclear torpedo, believing war had already begun. Only the objection of another officer prevented it. Behind the scenes, Kennedy and Khrushchev engaged in desperate diplomacy. Messages flew back and forth. Both leaders realized they were staring into the abyss. Finally, a deal was struck. The Soviets would remove the missiles from Cuba. In exchange, the Americans would pledge not to invade Cuba and would secretly remove their own missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended, but it had been far too close. Both sides realized that they needed better communication to prevent accidental war. The famous hotline between Washington and Moscow was established, a direct communication link for emergencies. The Cuban Missile Crisis led to a brief thaw in relations. Both superpowers signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, limiting nuclear testing. But the Cold War was far from over. It simply shifted to new battlegrounds. Southeast Asia became the next major flashpoint. In Vietnam, communist forces backed by the Soviet Union and China fought against a southern government supported by the United States. What started as limited American involvement escalated into a full-scale war. By the late 1960s, over 500,000 American troops were fighting in Vietnam. The war became deeply unpopular in the United States. Protests erupted. The conflict dragged on for years, costing tens of thousands of American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives. When American forces finally withdrew in 1973 and South Vietnam fell to the Communists in 1975, it was seen as a major defeat for U.S. containment strategy. But the Cold War continued elsewhere. In Afghanistan, when a communist government came to power in 1978 and faced rebellion, the Soviet Union invaded in 1979 to prop it up. The United States, learning from Vietnam, didn't send troops. Instead, they armed and funded Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen. For a decade, the Soviets fought a brutal guerrilla war in Afghanistan's mountains. It became the Soviet Union's Vietnam, a costly quagmire that drained resources and morale. The war contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union. By the 1980s, cracks were showing in the communist system. The Soviet economy was stagnant. The arms race was bankrupting the nation. Eastern European populations were increasingly restless under authoritarian rule. When Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he recognized that change was necessary. He introduced policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He loosened government control, allowed more freedom of speech, and tried to reform the economy. He also sought to reduce tensions with the West, engaging in arms control negotiations with U.S. President Ronald Reagan. But Gorbachev's reforms unleashed forces he couldn't control. Once people tasted freedom, they wanted more. In 1989, a wave of peaceful revolution swept Eastern Europe. Poland held free elections. Hungary opened its borders. The Baltic states demanded independence. And then on November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. East Berliners poured into the West. People attacked the wall with hammers and pickaxes, tearing down the symbol of division. It was one of the most joyous moments in modern history. The Soviet Union itself was unraveling. Republics declared independence. The economy collapsed. In August 1991, hardline communists attempted a coup against Gorbachev, trying to stop the reforms. The coup failed, but it accelerated the Soviet Union's demise. On December 26, 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. 15 independent nations emerged from its ruins. The Cold War was over. The West had won, not through military conquest, but through the failure of the communist system to deliver prosperity and freedom. But here's the shocking truth about the Cold War that many people don't fully grasp. While the superpowers never fought directly, the Cold War was devastating for millions of people around the world. Proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Angola, Nicaragua, and dozens of other nations killed millions. Entire countries were torn apart. Dictatorships were supported on both sides because they were ideologically aligned, even if they were brutal to their own people. The CIA overthrew democratically elected governments. The KGB assassinated dissidents. Both sides engaged in torture, disappearances, and human rights abuses in the name of their cause. The Cold War also created a massive opportunity cost. The trillions of dollars spent on weapons, military bases, and proxy wars could have been used for education, healthcare, infrastructure, and scientific research to improve human life. Instead, they built weapons capable of destroying humanity multiple times over. The psychological toll was enormous. Entire generations grew up under the shadow of potential nuclear war, never knowing if they'd wake up to mushroom clouds on the horizon. Yet paradoxically, the Cold War also drove innovation. The competition between superpowers accelerated technological development. The space race gave us satellite technology, computers, and telecommunications advances that benefit us today. Medical research, materials science, and countless other fields received massive funding because of military applications. The fear of falling behind motivated investment in education and science. The Cold War shaped the modern world in ways both terrible and transformative. The end of the Cold War didn't mean the end of conflict or ideological struggle. New challenges emerged. Regional conflicts continued. Terrorism became a major threat. The rise of China as an economic superpower created new geopolitical tensions. Russia, under Vladimir Putin, has sought to reassert influence in its former sphere, leading to conflicts in Georgia, Ukraine, and elsewhere. Some analysts speak of a new Cold War between the United States and China, or between the West and Russia. Nuclear weapons still exist in massive quantities. The threat hasn't disappeared. It's simply evolved. Looking back, the Cold War teaches us profound lessons about human nature, ideology, and power. It shows how fear can drive nations to the brink of mutual destruction. It demonstrates that ideological certainty, the absolute belief that your system is right and all others are wrong, can justify terrible actions. It reminds us that wars fought indirectly, through proxies and covert operations, still cause immense suffering even if the great powers never directly clash. And it proves that even the mightiest empires can crumble when their systems fail, to meet the needs and aspirations of their people. The Cold War was a conflict of ideas fought with weapons, propaganda, and proxy armies. It was a war where the biggest battles were never fought because both sides knew that true total war would mean total annihilation. It reshaped the globe, dividing nations, influencing revolutions, and determining the fate of billions. It ended not with a bang but with the quiet collapse of a system that could no longer sustain itself. The shocking truth about the Cold War is this: it wasn't really about communism versus capitalism. It was about power, security, and the age-old human desire to shape the world according to your own vision. Both sides committed atrocities in the name of their ideals. Both sides truly believed they were fighting for humanity's future, and both sides nearly destroyed everything in the process. As we move further into the 21st century, the lessons of the Cold War remain urgently relevant. We still live in a world with nuclear weapons. We still face ideological divisions. We still see powerful nations seeking to expand their influence and impose their vision of how the world should work. The technology has changed, the players have evolved, but the fundamental dynamics of power, fear, and ideology remain. Understanding the Cold War helps us understand our present and maybe, just maybe, avoid repeating its mistakes. It reminds us that dialogue is better than confrontation, that mutual understanding is preferable to mutual destruction, and that the cost of conflict, even cold conflict, is measured in millions of lives disrupted, damaged, or destroyed. This was the Cold War, a war that shaped a generation and transformed the world, a war fought in the shadows and proxy battlefields, a war that, despite never officially being declared or fought directly between its main protagonists, dominated global affairs for nearly 5 decades and brought humanity to the edge of extinction multiple times. If you found this deep dive into one of history's most complex and dangerous periods fascinating, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps the channel reach more people who want to understand the forces that shaped our modern world. Subscribe to Neural Battlefields for more content exploring the conflicts, strategies, and hidden truths that define human history. And share this with anyone who wants to understand how the world we live in today was forged in the crucible of the Cold War. What aspect of the Cold War do you find most intriguing? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read them all. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the neural battlefields of history.